approve.
So moved. This is Ted Nemec.
Is there a second?
Second, Katie Nelson.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Those opposed, say no. Minutes are approved. I want to call on Parvani Stovar for the agency report. Commissioner Rockensus has some kind of conference or something today. So Parvani, do you have a report for us?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, everybody. Thanks everyone for being here today. Brian apologizes that he's late today. Unfortunately, he's off campus at the Wetlands Task Force meeting, so he wanted to make sure I expressed his apologies that he's not able to be here. And he set me in his place to entertain you guys until he's able to get here, so hopefully I'll be able to do that. Some quick agency updates for you. Obviously, staffing is one of our highest priorities these days, and it's one of the things that Brian and I spend the most time working on. We thankfully just hired a new communications director, Alan Carter, who will be starting with IDEM on Monday. He's a former reporter and currently the communications director for the Secretary of State's office. So I know that he's going to be a really great addition to our team. And since this group last met, we've also hired 2 staff members to focus on environmental justice efforts across the state. One of those individuals is located in Northwest Indiana, and one is here in our central office to serve the rest of the state. And those 2 roles are really going to be focused on community engagement and serving as a liaison to disadvantaged communities so that they really are aware of the work that IDEM's doing and get insight on how to become more involved and engaged in our processes. So again, we just hired those folks in the last couple of months, and we're really excited to have them on board. We also recently hired Carl Woodridge to serve as Deputy Assistant Commissioner of the Office of Program Support. So that's the group that includes that environmental stakeholder engagement program, as well as recycling programs, education and outreach efforts, things like that. And we just stole him from the DNR, and we're really happy to have his expertise on a lot of the Lake Michigan programs. So he's great to have on board as well. And besides staffing, we've really been busy lately trying to prepare for the 2023 legislative session coming up. And if you've ever worked in the legislative world or have a lot of experience there, you know that prep for next session starts as soon as current session ends. So our legislative director didn't have much of a break before he started having to work with programs to try and figure out what our legislative needs might be for an agency. One issue that we know that we're going to need to pursue is revising our statute on air fees. And I think this might have been an issue that Brian has brought up to this body before. But Title V of the Clean Air Act requires that states operate air permitting programs funded exclusively by the permitting fees. And that fee revenue is based on emissions level and can't be supplemented, unfortunately, by general funds or other grant sources or things like that. And emissions have been steadily declining over the years, which is great for the environment, but bad for us because our funding goes down and our operating costs are not decreasing in the same time. And in fact, they're usually going up because of increased technology costs and staffing costs and things like that. So we're kind of stuck in this bad position where our fee revenue is no longer sufficient to run our program, which ultimately is going to get us into trouble with the EPA. So we need to tweak the statute to allow us to look at those air fees and eventually, bring that to this body to work with you to figure out how we can stabilize that revenue structure. And then the other thing also relates to this group. We would love to tackle air designations. And as you guys all know too well, when an area moves from attainment to non-attainment or good to bad for air quality purposes, the change is effective immediately. But when the opposite happens and air quality improves from non-attainment to attainment, statute requires that this body adopt additional rules for that change to take effect, which ends up just dragging out the process for a number of months when we don't really need that to be the case. So we would love to remove that requirement that this body adopt additional rules so the change can take effect immediately. So we're still in early talks with the governor's office about our legislative agenda and what that process is going to look like, but just kind of wanted to give a little preview of some of the things that we're considering. And we'll be sure to update you guys at the next meeting, whatever we end up deciding on. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions for Parvani?
Yeah, since you're doing all this hiring and staff turnover, can you provide the board with organizational chart when it gets kind of all settled?
Absolutely, I would love to.
Thank you.
I have one question about some staffing up. have these positions been vacant for a while, or you just getting permission to fill them, or what? I'm delighted to see it, but
So
you know,
Yeah, the positions I mentioned have not been vacant for a while. At the last meeting, I had wanted to provide an update on our new communications director. She since resigned for another role in the private sector, so we had to do a round of hiring again to find a new communications director. We've just finished up that process, so we've unfortunately had a lot of turnover on our communications team, and now hopefully it's settled down a little bit and we don't have to spend so much time interviewing for that role. The two new environmental justice positions, obviously those are brand new positions that we worked on with the governor's office and state budget agency on getting approval to even post those in the first place. So they're brand new. We're kind of building them from scratch to see what the needs are and how we can be most effective to communities across the state. And then the deputy assistant commissioner role, that was one that came through a vacancy. Julia Wickard left the assistant commissioner role earlier this year, which made a vacancy for Bob Luger to move up into, and we're filling Bob's previous role. So it's a lot of moving parts. It's not that these have been sitting vacant for a long time. It's just the process to get them filled once people get promoted and move around. We do have a number of other positions posted available for IDEM. You know, some of them were more successful than others in getting high quality applicants. The governor's office and state personnel are working on a massive salary study to compare our salaries to market rate, comparing us to private sector, other public sector and nonprofit areas. We're hoping once the results of that are eventually released, hopefully later this year, that'll allow us to be more competitive in the positions that we're posting and really attract higher quality candidates. So it's a never ending, job for us, but we're hopeful that we're going to get some tools that will really help us thrive in that area.
well, we hope that happens soon. So thank you. Now I want to call on Chris Peterson for a rulemaking report.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Peterson in the Rules Development section of the Office of Legal Counsel. Before I go over the anticipated rules for the next board meeting, I'd like to explain the change made in the agenda for today's meeting and the reason for it. The need for frequent updates to the air attainment status designation tables in state rule at 326 IAC 1-4 and the length and complexity of the rulemaking process established in Indiana statute results in problems for revisions to the designation tables, particularly when the table for a particular county is open to in more than one rulemaking. This often happens with counties that have a larger number of regulated sources and then move back and forth between attainment and non-attainment for various pollutants. Indiana Code 13-17-314 requires the board to adopt rules that classify regions into attainment and non-attainment areas for the regulated pollutants. Since it is US EPA that actually establishes and revises these area classifications, the state rule is done only to reflect the federal status. However, due to the length of even the expedited rulemaking process, this results in a gap between the federal and state effective dates of up to a year. The board adopts emergency rules to bridge the gap until the regular rulemaking is completed and the state rule is again consistent with the federal designation. It is important that the department be able to efficiently issue air permits in these areas using the appropriate requirements that are determined by the designation of the area. As you may have noticed, the counties with the highest number of regulated sources and for which most permits are issued are also those that are most likely to develop attainment problems and require rulemakings to change the designation status to be consistent with the federal designations. This is a good example of why addressing this issue as part of IDEM's legislative initiative for the coming year is so important. As this relates to today's meeting, we have removed the Lake and Porter ozone redesignation regular rulemaking from the agenda. This rule dealt with changes to designations for the 2008 8-hour ozone standard and related emission reporting requirements. It is our understanding that US EPA is planning to publish a new rule that will change the designations for the 2015 8-hour ozone standard for Lake and Porter counties within the next few weeks. The designations for these two standards are in the same tables, and it would be difficult and confusing to have two rules revising the same sections very close together, running very close together in the rulemaking process. So rather than trying to coordinate two separate rulemakings that are revising the same sections, we're going to combine them into one new rule that includes all the ozone updates for those counties to be started as soon as the new federal rule is published. Next, this will put the Lake and Porter County's ozone rulemaking on roughly the same track as the Clark and Floyd County ozone redesignation rulemaking. So we are going to add those counties into the same rulemaking also, so that there's only one rulemaking to address revisions to the ozone designations. This will greatly reduce the work needed for rule development, and the board will only have one rule to consider. In today's board packet, we have left the two emergency rules separate since they had already been developed and included in the board packet. However, the Lake and Porter ozone redesignation emergency rule was revised to include a change to the 2015 8-hour ozone designation for a portion of Porter County that has not yet been promulgated. That is the reason why you have a new documents, a new rule information sheet, and new draft emergency rule for that one. This is reflected in the updated version of the two documents that were provided in your folder today, and it was sent out electronically yesterday, and it's in, as I said, in your folders. At the next meeting, we expect to present one ozone redesignation emergency rule that combines these two emergency rules and the expected changes to Lake and Porter County that EPA is likely to be publishing soon. And then at a subsequent meeting, we will present one regular expedited rulemaking, which will combine all the ozone designations into one rule. So that rule will cover Clark, Floyd, Lake, and Porter counties all at one time. Once completed, the emergency rules will no longer be needed. Several updated documents were sent electronically to you this week. On Monday, we sent a copy of the form relating to the non-rule policy document on disclosure statement requirements for CFO approval applications that will be presented later today. Yesterday, we sent you the revised agenda as well as the revised rule information sheet and draft emergency rule for Lake and Porter ozone redesignations emergency rule. And then in a separate email yesterday, you should have received an updated list of board members and contact information. For board members participating today, you do have the hard copies of those documents in the folders. So at this point, I'd like to stop and see if there are any questions about what I've already covered before I move on to the rules we anticipate for the next board meeting.
Chris, let me make sure that I understand this. The two rule item number D2 and D3 as on the agenda, we have new language for those, right? Or are those the ones that we consider?
For the emergency rules on the agenda today, the Clark and Floyd emergency rule is exactly what was sent out in the original board packet.
Mhm.
And then for the Lake and Porter emergency rule, we sent out the revised versions of the rule information sheet and the draft emergency rule yesterday. And then for those in the room, they have a hard copy in their folders also. So that's the only one that's actually changed since the original board packet went out.
Okay.
If there's no other questions, yes.
It just confused me a little bit when I was going over the original documents about the emission reporting part, because that was left out of it was left out of the emergency rule, but it was in the other rule.
Right.
So,
The reason for that is the emergency rules are really only really done to set the designation status for permitting purposes. So the emissions reporting portion was not an emergency per se, so we're going to still handle that in the regular rule.
right, and reason why I wasn't gonna originally comment on it, because their deadline was July or something. I figured we could finalize that, but we might need to do that for the sources that have to report.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at all that, but
Okay.
right now, if the new federal rule comes out as quickly as they anticipate, we're going to have that moving pretty quick.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions about this?
Okay, I'll go
It'll
ahead.
be nice if we could get permission from EPA to just not have to go through this with every one of these redesignations, because I mean, they make the designations.
Yeah, they establish the designations, and then it's Indiana statute that requires us to put those into the rule. So if that is able to be changed in some way so that the permitting is no longer dependent on that state designation being in the rule, then we hope to be in a position where the permitting people can just designate or do the permitting based on the designation as soon as it's effective at the federal level. So
But to
there
do
would be-
that, but to do that, it takes the legislature to give us permission to do it, correct?
Okay.
Okay.
For the next board meeting, right now, we're tentatively anticipating that will be on November 9th of this year. And at that meeting, we anticipate presenting one rule for final adoption that is going to be presented to you today for preliminary adoption, and that is ignitable hazardous waste. We also anticipate preliminary adoption of 3 rules. The first is Safety Clean SO2. This rule revises the sulfur dioxide monitoring and fuel sampling process requirements for Safety Clean Oil Recovery Company in Lake County to comply with an agreed order issued by IDEM. So it's basically just making changes to reflect the agreed order that's already in place. Next, the definition of solid waste for hazardous waste management. Because of recent actions at the federal and state levels, Indiana's current hazardous waste requirements are inconsistent with the federal definition of solid waste for the purposes of hazardous waste management. This rule will update the identification of solid waste for the purposes of hazardous waste management to be no less stringent than the federal requirements, and will include state-specific requirements to improve the availability of information and reduce the risk from the management of hazardous secondary materials. And it will do this while not requiring a hazardous waste facility permit if the regulated entity meets certain conditions. And then the third is underground storage tank provisions. This rule amends portions of the state underground storage tank rules to remove certain state requirements that are redundant and more stringent than federal requirements, reducing the costs and regulatory burdens on tank owners and the department while still protecting human health and the environment. The draft rule for the underground storage tank rule is soon going to be posted for second notice. And if it receives substantive comments during the 30-day comment period, the hearing for that may need to be postponed to a later meeting. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, we plan to have an emergency rule for the Clark, Floyd, Lake, and Porter counties ozone redesignations that we will continue to bring to the board until the regular rulemaking is completed. And that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer any additional questions.
Any questions? Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Today, we have 2 emergency rules that the board will be asked to adopt. Clark and Floyd counties ozone redesignation and Lake and Porter counties ozone redesignation. We will also have a hearing for the following regular rule board actions: final adoption of organic solvent degreasing operations correction, waste tires, municipal solid waste landfill emissions, City of Angola chloride variance revisions, and preliminary adoption of ignitable hazardous waste. There will be a hearing on non-expiring rules in accordance with the requirement of IC 13-14-9.5-1.1. There will be presentations for 2 non-rule policy documents for municipal solid waste landfills and applicability of 326 IEC 8-8 and 326 IEC 8-8.1 and disclosure statement requirements for CFO approval applications. And finally, an update on the citizens petition to request rulemaking on the 2012 EPA recreational water quality criteria. As a reminder, If you wish to testify in any of today's hearings, please fill out a comment card and give it to Carla at the sign-in table if you are there in person. The rules being considered at today's meeting were included in board packets and are available for public inspection at the Office of Legal Counsel, 13th floor, Indiana Government Center North. The entire board packet is also available on IDEM's website at least 1 week prior to each board meeting. A written transcript of today's meeting will be made. The transcript and any written submission will be open for public inspection at the Office of Legal Counsel. A copy of the transcript will be posted on the pages of the agency website when it becomes available. Will the official reporter of the cause please stand and raise your right hand and state your name?
Libby Meyer.
Do you solemnly affirm that you will keep complete and true notes of that, all that transpires, and prepare a transcript thereof, and faithfully perform all duties imposed upon you as an official reporter of the state of Indiana?
Yes.
Thank you very much. The board will now consider adoption of an emergency rule for the 2015 8-hour ozone redesignations for Clark and Floyd counties. This emergency rule incorporates current federal designation. Exhibit A, the draft emergency rule will be introduced now. Is there someone to present the emergency rule? Is it Seth Engdahl?
Yes, that's correct. I'm here. Members of the board, good afternoon. My name is Seth Engdahl, and I'm a rule writer in the Rules Development section of IDEM's Office of Legal Counsel. The emergency rule currently under consideration would supersede both 326 IAC 1-4-11 and 326 IAC 1-4-23. These sections are comprised of attainment status tables for certain air pollutants in Clark and Floyd counties. The only change being made is to each county's status for the 2015 8-hour ozone national ambient air quality standard, which is being changed from marginal non-attainment to attainment. We are making this change to maintain consistency with the federal designation that was published in the Federal Register on July 5th of this year. IDEM is requesting the board approve this emergency rule so that affected sources can be permitted under the appropriate state rule, while the regular rulemaking to incorporate these changes into the Indiana Administrative Code is completed. If adopted, permits issued to sources in Clark and Floyd counties will be issued under prevention of significant deterioration pursuant to 326 IAC 2-2. Currently, sources are issued permits under emissions offset pursuant to 326 IAC 2-3, which is more restrictive. Finally, to prevent any potential confusion, I would like to point out two typos in the rule information sheet that was sent to the board. In the reasons for the rules section, it says that the redesignation was published by US EPA on July 5th, 2020. It should instead say July 5th, 2022. The date in the overview section is correct. Additionally, the rule information sheet mentions nitrous oxides as a precursor emission to ozone. It should instead say oxides of nitrogen. IDEM requests that the board approve this emergency rule as presented, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Does the board have any questions? Okay, thank you so much, Seth. Is there board discussion? Is there a motion to adopt the emergency rule?
Yes.
So moved,
So
Bill
moved.
Etzler.
Second, Ted Nemec.
This is a roll call vote. Mr. Waskey,
Yes.
Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Mr. Horn,
Yes.
Ms. Nelson,
yes,
Mr. Chambers,
yes,
Dr. Nemec,
Yes.
Mr. Ketzenberger,
Yes.
Ms. Kurowski,
Yes.
Mr. Bortner,
Yes.
Mr. Schuler,
Yes.
Mr. Rulon, and Dr. Alexandrovich,
Yes.
Miss, let's see, Mr. Esler,
Yes.
okay. And the chair votes aye. The vote is 13 ayes, 0 nays, so the emergency rule is adopted. The board will now consider adoption of an emergency rule for the 2008 8-hour ozone redesignation for Lake and Porter counties and the 2015 8-hour ozone redesignation for Porter County. This emergency rule temporarily incorporates the current federal designation. I'll now introduce Exhibit B, the draft emergency rule, into the record of the hearing. Caitlin Walsh will present the emergency rule.
Good afternoon, members of the board. I'm Keelan Walsh with the Rules Development Section of the Office of Legal Counsel, and I'm here to present the emergency rule for Lake and Porter Counties ozone redesignations for your consideration. This rule temporarily amends 326 IAC 1-4-46 and 326 IAC 1-4-65 to update the attainment designation status of Lake and Porter counties to attainment for the 2008 8-hour ozone standard based on the final rule published in the Federal Register on May 20th, 2022. This rule also updates the attainment designation status of the northern townships of Center, Jackson, Liberty, Pine, Portage, Union, Washington, and Westchester in Porter County for the 2015 8-hour ozone standard based on the final rule published in the Federal Register on June 14th, 2021. This emergency rule will ensure that affected sources are permitted under the less restrictive PSD requirements in 326 IAC 2-2 instead of the more restrictive emission offset requirements in 326 IAC 2-3. Adoption of this emergency rule is necessary to ensure the immediate update of the attainment designation status of Lake and Porter counties and Porter County townships until the regular Section 8 rulemaking has been completed. Item respectfully requests that the board finally adopt this emergency rule as presented, and program staff and I are available to answer any further questions you may have. Thank you.
Any questions for Keelan? If not, thank you. Is there board discussion? Do I hear a motion to adopt the emergency rule?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
This is a roll call vote. Mr. Woski,
Yes.
Mr. Davidson, Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Mr. Horn,
Yes.
Ms. Nelson,
Yes.
Mr. Chambers,
Yes.
Dr. Nemec,
Yes.
Mr. Katzenberger,
Yes.
Ms. Karowski,
Yes.
Mr. Bortner.
Yes.
Mr. Schuler,
Yes.
Dr. Alexandrovich,
Yes.
Mr. Etzler,
Yes.
the chair votes aye. The total is 13 ayes, 0 nays. The emergency rule is adopted. Okay, this is a public hearing before the Environmental Rules Board of the State of Indiana concerning final adoption of amendments to rules at 326 IAC 8-3-1, organic solvent degreasing operations correction. I will now introduce Exhibit C, the draft rule, into the record of the hearing. Mary Ann Stevens will present the rule.
Good afternoon, members of the board. I'm Mary Ann Stevens, a rule writer in the Office of Legal Counsel, Rules Development Section. In a rulemaking concerning cold cleaning degreasing alternative, LSA document 18-542, adopted by the board in February of 2021, an exemption was created at 326 IAC 8-3-1A1 for degreasers that have the potential to emit fewer than 15 pounds per day of volatile organic compounds. The exemption text was added to be consistent with similar language in 326 IAC 8-1-1. However, the United States Environmental Protection Agency has stated that this type of exemption is not appropriate for degreasing, for which typical exemptions are based on use, such as medical cleaning or surface area size of the equipment. The exemption as stated in 326 IAC 8-3-1A1 would lead to some units no longer being regulated. Therefore, US EPA has indicated that the exemption is not a change that can be approved. This rulemaking is to remove the exemption that was added to 326 IAC 8-3-1A1, which will provide consistency with the Indiana State Implementation Plan and allow US EPA to approve the other changes that were made under the earlier rulemaking of LSA document 18-542 regarding cold cleaning degreasing alternative. Therefore, IDEM asks for the board's vote for adoption of this rulemaking to remove the exemption at 326 IAC 8-3-1A1. If there are any questions, I can provide answers, and other IDEM staff members are also here to provide answers.
Any questions for Mary Ann or any other staff members concerning this?
Chairman Guard, I have a series of questions.
Okay, yeah, Dr. Alexandrovich.
There's like two sets. One is on the facilities that might get exemptions or have exemptions. And then there's another set on SIP procedures. So I think I'll keep them separate and start with one set. And the first one is about the facilities that have exemptions. So before we passed the last regulation, the existence of the exemption was there. So approximately how many sources and what kind of sources have exemptions?
I think I'm going to call on some air staff members. Susan Benn is here. This is her expertise.
Hi, I'm Susan Benn. And you asked how many sources currently have exemptions or?
That's correct. And what types of sources they are?
Well, degreasers there's numerous degreasers throughout the state at a variety of sources, large industrial sources, auto body refinishing shops, it's metal solvent
Okay,
cleaning,
so
so.
About how many exemptions do you have?
But you talk about 15 pound per day exemption.
Yeah.
And the 15 pounds per day would be for the very small degreasers. And there's very small auto body shops out there. There's numerous numbers.
So, okay, so you have a list of them because the regulations require approval from the commissioner.
Well, the ones that we have, the sources that are permitted have degreasers in their permits. And then if they're going to take that 15 pound per day exemption, they have a limit written into their permit and it's not the requirements associated with that exemption.
Excuse me.
Yeah, I know, I'm the branch of the air, so I can probably handle those questions.
Yeah.
And we'll get to the second one, we'll get you back up here for the second.
Okay.
There are certain exemptions, so just to be clear, that 15 pound per day did not exist in Article 83 prior to the recent rulemaking.
But it is in 8-1.
It
That's
is
why.
an 8-1, and it's required to be SIP approved if they're going to use that exemption.
So yeah, I was interested in how many sources have exemptions under 8-1-1.
None that I know.
Interesting. So the next one was how many facilities might be automatically exempted, so that would be like very few.
So you're saying under this 8.3 exemption that we want to take out?
Yeah,
No, I think there's a lot that would come in and try to argue that they are less than 15 pounds a day and therefore exempt.
okay.
And then, as Chris said, the EPA has said there's not a 15 pound per day exemption for degreasers. The intent was, if you go back to the CDG, there are hundreds of thousands of these around the nation, and they do, at least back in '88, they added up to a very large amount of VOCs through all of these small incremental units, and therefore they did not feel that having an exemption was appropriate. There are some exemptions, she said that they're cleaning some, not pharmaceutical, but electronic components. There are some NESHAPs and NSPSs that apply to cold cleaning degreasers, so the very large ones, they're using very hazardous materials. If a cold cleaner degreaser is subject to one of the federal rules, it is exempt from our rule because the federal rules are definitely more stringent.
I was curious about how many sources were already exempted. So those exempted under 8-1 are in their permits or it's separate?
If they're exempted by the rule outside of the 15 pounds per day because they're subject to a NESHAP or they are a electronic cleaner or they're using a VOC less than 1% by weight of their cleaning solution, we will document that in the technical support document. This is why the rule is not in their permit.
Okay, thank you. Now my SIP questions, and actually I was hoping that the commissioner was here because some years ago I asked Commissioner Easterly how many outstanding SIP approvals we have under our rules. So I don't know, but this one is also one of those SIP needs for SIP approvals. So under what circumstances does IDEM propose rules to EPA for review? Because one would have thought they might have caught that before. And how many SIP approvals might be outstanding? And in the commissioner's document, his determination, findings and determination mentioned that sources would know that the exemption was not SIP compliant, but how would they know?
Well, 8-3 is one of our SIP approved rules. And then as Mary Ann mentioned earlier, we modified this rule in 2021 and we submitted that rule for SIP approval. And as part of that review process by EPA, this issue was identified. And once this rulemaking is complete, EPA will be able to move forward with the SIP approval. Source EPA, once they approve something, it gets codified into the Code of Federal Regulations, and so sources can check to see what rules are SIP approved, and if this state rule is part of the Indiana SIP. And then you also asked how many other rules are not or are in the SIP approval process.
Yeah.
We meet with EPA regularly. We probably have 6 to 8 rulemakings that they're actively reviewing.
Okay, so so there is a process. Once you submit a rule, you submit it to EPA for approval, and then that goes into the Federal Register.
Once we submit it to EPA for approval, they have 18 months to act on it. And once they actually approve it, it is recognized with the Federal Register notice, and it shows the effective date of that.
Okay. All right, so I'm just kind of thinking that the sources who might have wanted to take the exemption wouldn't know that it was not SIP approved. That was kind of my point.
And there is a table in the CFR that shows they are aware of the signature.
Because as soon as EPA came back and said, we are not going to approve this rule with the 15 pound per day exemption in there, we immediately shared that with the entire staff. We reached out to consultants and let consultants know that. We have had companies that have come in wanting to utilize that, and we inform them, it is on our state books, it is not federally approved. We really can't let you use that rule, and if you do insist, you're opening yourself up to the federal action. So far, nobody has taken advantage of that rule because we've been able to explain to them why they need to just let it go.
Okay, it just seemed that it was like horses and carts and why the EPA didn't review it
The
before.
cogs don't always fit together neatly, but they try to work together to make sure that we are getting the word out. And in this situation, I mean,
I am not aware of a single company that has utilized that rule, because we very quickly became aware of the EPA stance on it. And very quickly, we had sources to know that, no, we couldn't use it. After the consultants, to let the consultants know what the status was on the rule. And to this point, I am not aware of any sources that have had that, utilized that rule to get out of it.
Okay, one final thing, is there a table in the CFR for all of our SIP approved rules?
Right, yeah, and that's what I was just gonna add, there, once they, EPA does approve, there is a portion of the CFR where there's a table, and you can look at all the rule citations in order to see what's in the SIP and what's.
Could you send me that citation, please?
Mhm. Yeah, I don't know what it is. Off the top of my head.
It's 40 CFR 81.315. And I will tell you that it is not completely up to date, but it's at least a good start. And if you have any questions about it, feel free to give me a call, because I'm trying to maintain a more current version.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a couple, Chair Guard. I'll be brief. I appreciate everybody's in depth of knowledge, because I'm traditionally a land quality guy, not these air things. So I tend not to ask a lot, but it did seem like it's a broad applicability compared to where it had been. But so the exemption, the people, you mentioned there's thousands of these out there, right, which is a fair statement, maybe an underestimate. But do those people realize they're operating under an exemption if they're just a small parts place or some small auto body? Do they realize they're living under an exemption that's going away, and how would we educate that?
Well, so one thing, up until 2021, that exemption didn't exist. Okay, there is a requirement, CCAP reaches out, they're aware that companies that have small parts degreasers that may not need any other air permit, but they have it, they still have to comply with Article 8.3. And so CTAP's aware of that. They've done a lot of outreach to these types of communities, organizations, to make sure that the car dealers, people are aware of this and comply with it. Like I said, the exemption came into play in 2021. I don't think a small company would be aware that it came on the books and just voluntarily decide to go, comply, say I'm not subject to it anymore. The larger companies that did see that and wanted to try to get out from underneath complying with 8.3 on that exemption, again, we were fortunate EPA was very quick in making the determination that they would not approve that in our SIP. So we were able to reach out to the companies as permits came in and reach out to consultants and say, you can't use it.
Fair enough. Thanks. I think it's a good example where Indiana tried to work with sources.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. Those staff members that worked on this. Are there any speaker cards?
No, ma'am.
Well, the hearing is concluded. The board will now consider final adoption of amendments to Rules 326 IC 8-3-1 Organic Solvent Degreasing Operations Correction. Is there any board discussion? Okay, hearing none, do I hear a motion to adopt the rules as presented?
So moved, Bill Etzler.
Is there a second?
Chris Horn, second.
This is a roll call vote. Mr. Woski,
Yes.
Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Mr. Horn,
Yes.
Ms. Nelson,
Yes.
Mr. Chambers,
Yes.
Dr. Nemick,
Yes.
Mr. Ketzenberger. Mr. Ketzenberger, unmute you. Ms. Krasowski,
Yes.
Ms. Krasowski. I think you have your mic muted.
Yes. Right.
Mr. Bortner,
Yes.
Mr. Schuler,
Yes.
Dr. Alexandrovich,
Yes.
Mr. Etzler.
yes,
The chair votes aye. There's 13 ayes, 0 nays. The rule is adopted. This is a public hearing before the Environmental Rules Board of the State of Indiana concerning final adoption of amendments to rules at 329 IAC 15 waste tires. I will now introduce Exhibit D. The rule is preliminarily adopted with items suggested changes into the record of the hearing. Dan Watts will present the rule.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Guard, members of the board. I'm Dan Watts of the Rules Development Section, and I'm presenting LSA document 17-279 for final adoption. Item is proposing extensive amendments to 329 IAC 15, which has not been significantly revised since it was originally adopted over 20 years ago. The rulemaking updates the existing waste tire management requirements based on compliance and enforcement situations encountered over the years, and adds new requirements for the legitimate use of waste tires. Since preliminary adoption, item has made many amendments, which you'll see underlined, due to comments from the Office of Management Budget during their review of the draft rule language for the fiscal impact analysis approval. These amendments were necessary for item to obtain this fiscal approval. And the changes include, the amendments were necessary to get the approval and then move forward to final adoption. And the changes include reducing repetition of statutory requirements and definitions, fully listing out the information required on forms, applications, and reports, clarification of requirements for registration and changes to financial assurance, addition of specific ascertainable standards for requirements that might be overly general, and other changes to address inaccurate language, make corrections, and improve wording throughout the rules. Item has also made other changes since preliminary adoption based on comments from the board and input from waste tire program staff. During the preliminary adoption, the proposed alternative design and compliance standards at 15-3-17.5 were created because the current waste tire management standards already include some limited compliance flexibility to accomplish that goal. The waste tire facility fee requirements were amended or repealed in a separate rulemaking that the board has already adopted that comprehensively addressed the solid waste fees. Changes to the financial assurance requirements specify the types of surety bonds available to regulated entities. And for the pre-approved legitimate use requirements, item has added a blanket exemption for uses of less than 100 PTEs and basic management standards to prevent threats to public health and environment. So while these changes are extensive, item does not anticipate a significant fiscal impact because the majority of changes do not add new requirements or compliance costs. Instead, they clarify or streamline the existing requirements at the request of OMB or item program staff. Some regulated entities may experience cost savings with the proposed compliance alternatives or the option for the legitimate use of waste tires. Items also reached out to registered facilities during the comment periods and did not receive any comments or feedback on the amendments. Representatives from item are available to answer questions you may have for this rulemaking. Department respectfully requests the board adopt these proposed updates and improvements to the waste tire management rules. Thank you very much.
I have a question. It's hard to believe that it's been 20 years. This was Representative Wilkins and my initiative in the General Assembly, the original rule. And it was originally passed because of so many abandoned piles of tires and fires and mosquitoes and everything that waste tires bring on. Are you seeing fewer waste tire fires? I know that once they start, they're really very difficult to deal with. over the 20 years, has what we did worked?
Right, it has, I think. Lori, you can talk more about that. But every time there's a big fire, it seems to pop up in the news, which doesn't seem that common.
Sure, my name is Lori Freeman. I'm the Compliance Branch Chief for the Office of Land Quality. There are fewer firefighters. I believe the fires that we tend to see now tend to be more localized to shredding operations, and they're caught fairly quickly and extinguished fairly quickly, although they are still a significant problem at those facilities and often require multiple fire departments to respond, because they're usually in smaller towns where several fire departments will be responding. And there seems to be fewer abandoned piles of tires out in the Indiana landscape, because we have waste tire processors and facilities to take them now. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It's just, I'm just curious if it did work, and it sounds like these amendments to the rule are warranted. So thank you very much. Any other board members have any questions?
I do, Chairman Guard. Joanne.
Yes.
I have questions on 3 different pages of the rule. On page 3 of 54, it looks like you're adding new reporting requirements for local governments and waste management districts to notify IDEM about a tire amnesty day.
Yeah.
So I'm like wondering why that's necessary, because they have to use the regulated transporters and tire people, tire processor. And okay, if we agree to this in there, are you guys going to reach out to these local governments and solid waste management districts to let them know they have these new reporting requirements?
I believe the plan is to reach out to them. The waste tire amnesty day was added via statute as an option, and it was never incorporated into the rules. And so we want to make sure that they understand that they still need to, the things they need to require, that comply with in order not to create any problems and issues.
So the statute requires that the amnesty days report to you guys.
The statute allows for an amnesty day that didn't previously exist. And we're asking so we can assist them to make sure that they have no issues with those tires and those facilities.
Okay. My next question, on 10 of 54 is a matter of curiosity, and this is old text. The existing rule that the department oversees contracts with waste tire processing operators.
We do when we hire them for tire cleanups of open dumps in the state.
Okay, okay. And then my last one, and this is definitely not least, on page 48, there's the deletion of requiring the prevention of accumulation of water. That to me seems inappropriate, given the fact that wet tires are happy mosquito grounds.
I think that's because it was added as a general requirement to all of these pre-approved conditions, that they have to make sure that they don't hold water.
Yeah, kind of talk about.
Yes, it's up now in section 15-6-3A3 on page 47. Waste tires must be altered to prevent the accumulation of water.
Okay. I guess
Oh,
that
48. I thought you were talking about 47.
She was talking on page 48, and that one was deleted from page 48 because a general requirement for all of the pre-approved uses to not hold water was added to
okay.
on page 47.
Okay, thank you. I missed that.
Not a problem.
Dr. Rich, to your original question, are we going to reach out and educate again?
Yeah, because it's doubtful that they knew that this rule was up, and that, you know, next time they have a plan, they're like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
Thank
We
you.
will.
Any other? Thank you, Dan. Are there any speaker cards?
No, ma'am.
Any more questions from the board? Hearing none, the board will now consider final adoption of amendments to rules at 329 IC 15 waste tires. Board discussion. Is there a motion to adopt items suggested changes?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Chris Horn.
Okay, this is a roll call vote. Mr. Woski,
Yes.
Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Mr. Horn,
Yes.
Ms. Nelson,
Yes.
Mr. Chambers,
Yes.
Dr. Nemec,
yes,
Mr. Ketzenberger,
Yes.
Ms. Kurowski,
Yes.
Mr. Bortner,
Yes.
Mr. Schuler,
Yes.
Dr. Alexandrovich,
Yes.
and the chair votes aye. The vote is 13 ayes, 0 nays. Sorry, lost my place. 0 nays, the rule is, the amendments to the rule are adopted. Okay. Now, we need to have a motion to final adopt the rules as amendment. Previous one was the amendments to the. This is a roll call vote. We need a motion.
So moved, Madam Chair. Ortner.
Is there a second?
Second.
Roll call. Mr. Woski,
Yes.
Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Mr. Horn,
Yes.
Ms. Nelson,
Yes.
Mr. Chambers,
Yes.
Dr. Nemec,
yes,
Mr. Ketzenberger,
Yes.
Ms. Kurowski,
Yes.
Mr. Bortner,
Yes.
Mr. Schuler,
Yes.
Dr. Alexandrovich,
Yes.
Mr. Essler,
Yes.
chair votes aye. We have 13 ayes and 0 nays. The final rule is adopted. This is a public hearing before the Environmental Rules Board, the state of Indiana concerning final adoption of 326 ISC 8-8.2 municipal solid waste landfill emissions. I will now introduce Exhibit E, the proposed rule, into the record of the hearing. Keelan Welch or Walsh will present the rule.
Hello again, I'm Keelan Walsh, and I'm here to present rule number 22-109, municipal solid waste landfill emissions update for your consideration. On May 21st, 2021, US EPA published a final rule at 40 CFR 62 subpart 000 that requires states to submit plans implementing the 2016 municipal solid waste landfills emission guidelines. Indiana is currently operating under state rules that implemented the federal new source performance standards at 40 CFR 60 subpart 000 and emission guidelines for municipal solid waste landfills at 40 CFR 60 subpart 2C that US EPA promulgated on March 16, 1996. Well, US EPA's intention was for the 2021 federal plan to replace the existing 2016 approved state plan. The federal rules for the 2016 emission guidelines did not repeal 40 CFR 60 subpart W that Indiana state rules rely on. Consequently, the municipal solid waste landfills in Indiana are now subject to both the federal plan at 40 CFR 62 subpart 000, as well as the 1996 emission guidelines and state rules, which creates conflicting requirements for Indiana sources. This rulemaking will repeal 326 IAC 8-8 and 326 IAC 8-8.1 and add a new rule at 326 IAC 8-8.2 to incorporate 40 CFR 62 subpart 000 for municipal solid waste landfills into state rules. The incorporation by reference also includes the updated federal language published on February 14, 2022 in the Federal Register. Once approved by US EPA, the federal plan will no longer be in effect in Indiana, which will remove the conflicting federal and state requirements. Item is also addressing this conflict with the non-rule policy document in the interim until this rulemaking is final and effective, and that is also being presented to you today. Item respectfully requests that the board finally adopt this rule as presented, and program staff and I are available to answer any other questions that you have.
Any questions? Thank you, Kaylin. Are there any speaker cards? The hearing is concluded. The board will now consider final adoption of 326 IAC 8-8.2 municipal solid waste landfill emissions. Is there board discussion? Is there a motion to adopt the rules as presented? Is there a second?
Second.
This is roll call. Mr. Waskey, Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Mr. Horn,
Yes.
Ms. Nelson,
yes,
Mr. Chambers,
Yes.
Dr. Nemec,
Yes.
Mr. Katzenberger,
Yes.
Ms. Karofsky,
Yes.
Mr. Bortner,
Yes.
Mr. Schuler,
Yes.
Dr. Alexandrovich,
Yes.
Mr. Etzler. Mr. Etzler? Bill, unmute. Mr. Etzler?
yes,
Thank you. The chair votes aye. 13 ayes, 0 nays. The rule is adopted. This is a public hearing before the Environmental Rules Board of the State of Indiana concerning final adoption of amendments to rules at 327 IAC 2-1.5-17 City of Angola chloride variance revisions. I will now introduce Exhibit F. The rule is preliminarily adopted with items suggested changes into the record of the hearing. Crystal Hackney will present the rule.
Good afternoon, members of the board. My name is Crystal Hackney, and I'm a rule writer in the Rules Development section within the Office of Legal Counsel. I am here to present rule number 22-110 for the City of Angola's chloride variance limits concerning the monthly average and the daily maximum limits. This rulemaking brings the chloride variance limits up to date with the current NPDES permit. This update is required as part of the water quality standards variance process under 327 IAC 5-3-4.1M and reflects the variance limits for chloride that were recently approved in 2021. This rule was preliminarily adopted by the board on June 8, 2022. Other than minor grammar corrections throughout the rule, no substantial changes were made between preliminary adoption and today's hearing. Item requests that the board final adopt this rule as presented. Program experts and I are available to answer any further questions that you may have. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Crystal? Thank you, Crystal. Do we have any speaker cards?
No, ma'am.
This hearing is concluded. The board will now consider final adoption of amendments to rules at 327 IAC 2-1.5-17, City of Angola chloride variance revisions. Is there board discussion? Is there a motion to adopt items suggested changes?
So moved, Bill Etzler.
Is there a second?
Second.
This is a roll call vote. Mr. Waskey?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Horn?
Yes.
Ms. Nelson?
yes,
Mr. Chambers?
Yes.
Dr. Nemec?
yes,
Mr. Ketzenberger?
Yes.
Ms. Kurowski?
Yes.
Mr. Bortner?
Yes.
Mr. Schuler?
Yes.
Dr. Alexandrovich?
Yes.
Mr. Essler?
Sorry, I'm on mute. Yes.
The chair votes aye. We have 13 ayes, 0 nays. The suggested changes are adopted. Is there a motion to adopt the final rules as amended?
So moved.
Nemec is seconding this. Thanks.
Okay. Roll call. Mr. Waskey,
Yes.
Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Mr. Horn,
Yes.
Ms. Nelson,
yes,
Mr. Chambers,
Yes.
Dr. Nemec,
Yes,
Mr. Ketzenberger,
Yes.
Ms. Kurowski,
Yes.
Mr. Bortner,
Yes.
Mr. Schuler,
Yes.
Dr. Alexandrovich,
Yes.
Mr. Etzler.
Yes.
The chair votes aye. We have 13 ayes, 0 nays. The final rule is adopted as amended. This is a public hearing before the Environmental Rules Board of the State of Indiana concerning preliminary adoption of amendments to rules at 329 IAC 3.1-6-1, identification of ignitable hazardous waste. I will now introduce Exhibit G, the draft rule, into the record of the hearing. Dan Watts will present the rule.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Lagarde, members of the board. Representing LSA document 22-216 for preliminary adoption. This rulemaking amends the hazardous waste rules in 329 IAC 3.1 with the incorporation by reference of a recent federal rule that updates the standards for the identification of ignitable liquid hazardous waste. Because the rulemaking only includes federal requirements without additional state requirements, items using the abbreviated rulemaking process authorized under IC 13-14-9(7), which bypasses the first notice of comment period. The rule requirements include modernized test methods for making hazardous waste determinations for ignitable liquid waste. The main changes provide compliance flexibility in testing ignitable liquid waste and eliminate the requirements to use mercury-containing thermometers. Because the rulemaking provides additional compliance options, affected entities are not required to use these updated test methods and still can use the legacy test methods. However, the updated test methods are lower cost to administer over time and have environmental benefits compared to the current test methods. This rule also is a component of administering a authorized state hazardous waste program in which IDEM must maintain requirements that are consistent with and no less stringent than the federal hazardous waste requirements. In this case, the federal rules proposed for adoption are neither more nor less stringent than current requirements, but offer compliance options with potential cost savings for regulated entities. Representatives from IDEM are available to answer any questions you may have, and the department respectfully requests the board preliminary adopt this rule. So any authorized hazardous waste program can be consistent with current federal hazardous waste rules for the effective waste rules. Thank you.
Any questions for Dan? Thank you, Dan. Are there any speaker cards?
No, ma'am.
Well, this hearing is concluded. The board will now consider preliminary adoption of amendments to rules at 329 IAC 3.1-6-1, identification of ignitable hazardous waste. Any more board discussion? Is there a motion to adopt the rules as presented?
So moved, Bill Etzler.
Is there a second?
Second by
Second.
Katie Nelson.
Mr. Woski? Mr. Woski?
Yes.
Mr. Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Horn?
Yes.
Ms. Nelson?
Yes.
Mr. Chambers?
Yes.
Dr. Nemec?
Yes.
Mr. Ketzenberger?
Yes.
Ms. Korosky?
Yes.
Mr. Bortner?
Yes.
Mr. Schuler?
Yes.
Dr. Alexandrovich?
Yes.
Mr. Etzler?
Yes.
The chair votes aye. You have 13 ayes, 0 nays. The motion to adopt the rules as presented is adopted. This is a public hearing before the Environmental Rules Board of the State of Indiana concerning the review of rules that do not expire under IC 13-14-9.5-1.1. Every year, IDEM is required to publish a list of rules that have been effective for 7 years, but not subject to expiration because they are necessary for a federally designated program or to receive or maintain federal funding. This year, notices were published for the air rules in Title 326 and the waste rules in Title 329. A 30-day comment period was provided for each notice. No comments were received. I will now introduce Exhibit A, the list of rules in Title 326 that do not expire, and Exhibit 1, the list of rules in Title 329 that do not expire under IC 13-14-9.5-1.1 into the record of the hearing. At this time, is there anyone who would like to comment on any of the rules listed in either notice? Board members have any question? You know, we go through this every year. Are there any speaker cards?
No, ma'am.
Is there anybody else that wishes to speak on this rule? The hearing is concluded. The board must determine, based on comments received, whether to direct the agency to open a new rulemaking for any of the rules that are listed in the notices. If the board chooses not to ask for rulemaking, a motion should be made for no further action to be taken on the rules. Is there board discussion? I need a motion for either no further action on listed rules or to direct the agency to begin a rulemaking on a specific listed rule.
I make a motion for no further action, Bill Etzler.
Is there a second?
Second that motion, Chris Horn.
Roll call, Mr. Woski, Mr. Davidson,
Yes.
Mr. Horn,
Yes.
Ms. Nelson,
yes,
Mr. Chambers,
Yes.
Dr. Nemec,
yes,
Mr. Ketzenberger,
Yes.
Ms. Gorosky,
Yes.
Mr. Bortner,
Yes.
Mr. Schuler,
Yes.
Dr. Alexandrovich,
Yes.
Mr. Etzler.
yes,
The chair votes aye. We have 13 ayes, 0 nays. The motion for no further action is adopted. Now we have a non-rule policy document presentation. The presentation will be on the non-rule policy document by Marty Yates of IDEM's Office of Air Quality regarding municipal solid waste landfills and applicability of 326 IEC 8-8 and 326 IEC 8-8.1.
Good afternoon. First, I'd like to mention this during the public notice posting this non policy document draft did not receive any comments. The purpose of this non policy document is to explain items, intentions with regard to enforcement discretion during the interim time that landfills are subject to this duality of the rules as mentioned before, with the NSPS subpart 3W and the new federal plan, which was effective June of last year, found in 40 CFR 62 subpart 3 below. This policy applies to any municipal solid waste landfill subject to the Indiana rules currently at 326 IEC 8-8 or 8-8.1, and also currently subject to the current federal plan emission guidelines 40 CFR 62 subpart 3 below. The state rules currently 326 IEC 8-8.1 incorporate the new source performance standard subpart 3W by reference, which creates a duality, and that landfills are also subject to this new federal plan down to 40 CFR 62 subpart 3. Till the rulemaking is completed upon the effective date of this non-rule policy document, IDEM does not intend to enforce the requirements of the NSPS subpart 3W, which have to be put into the Title V operating permits that are the current state rules. This policy will remain in effect until 180 days after the effective date of rulemaking, when 326 IEC 8-8.2 replaces the two existing rules. Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you. We will now have a presentation on an unreal policy document by Corey Webb of IDEM's Office of Land Quality regarding disclosure statement required for CFO approval applications.
Good afternoon, members of the board. I'm Corey Webb, Deputy Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Land Quality at IDEM. I've got with me Susanna Bainland with our Office of Legal Counsel. I'm going to give a brief overview of what this is all about, the CPD, and then Susanna's going to fill in some of the blanks for some of the specifics. Under Indiana's disclosure law, IC 13-18-10-1.4, individuals or entities applying for approval to operate a confined feeding operation are required to disclose prior alleged violations of environmental laws in their application if certain conditions exist. This requirement applies specifically in instances where the responsible party applying for a CFO approval determines that prior material violations exist and that those prior material violations presented substantial endangerment to human health or the environment. While this disclosure law is not new, and while IDEM has never denied a CFO application due to issues with an applicant's disclosure, the agency has received questions in the past with regard to certain undefined statutory terms used in the disclosure law. The intent of this NPD is simply to provide clarity in that regard to both the industry and to the public, and to reduce any regulatory uncertainty associated with those terms or IDEM's interpretation of the law. IDEM incorporated feedback from the industry and also implemented revisions to the disclosure section of the CFO application in order to provide consistency with the NPD. And during the public comment period, we also did not receive any public comments for this.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Susanna Bigman. I'm an attorney with IDEM's Office of Legal Counsel. And as Corey mentioned, I'm here to give an overview of this NPD, the main goal of which is to clarify 3 terms in the disclosure law. The first is senior management official. So for a CFO applicant that is a business entity, each responsible party of that entity has to undergo their own disclosure review. Responsible party is defined in the disclosure statute, and that definition includes any senior management official of the applicant. The NPD explains that senior management official means any person with the highest level of management authority and who is responsible for the day-to-day tasks of managing the business. For LLCs in particular, because those tend to be the most common type of entity that we receive applications from, IDEM clarified that not all members of an LLC are necessarily senior management officials. So that question has come up before in the past. The second term is material violation. A responsible party only needs to disclose material violations under the disclosure law. In the NPD, IDEM interprets material violation to mean an alleged violation resulting in an administrative, civil, or criminal infliction. It also clarifies that IDEM violation letters on their own usually don't amount to a material violation. And again, that's an issue that has come up in the past. And the last term is substantial endangerment. A responsible party only needs to disclose material violations that presented substantial endangerment to human health or the environment. In the NPD, IDEM interprets substantial endangerment to mean a reasonable cause for concern that the public or environment may be exposed to a risk of harm. And the NPD also lists a number of factors to help the applicant determine whether substantial endangerment was present for a particular violation. And this interpretation in the NPD is consistent with how other IDEM programs define substantial endangerment. So in addition to defining these 3 terms, the NPD also gives a general description of the disclosure process, including IDEM's role in that process. It also addresses a conflict between 2 sections of the disclosure law regarding whether a disclosure statement is required if a responsible party's only violations are older than 5 years. So the NPD clarifies that a disclosure statement is required for all material violations, but the disclosure statement submitted in the application does not need to include a description of violations that are older than 5 years. And we think this interpretation does a good job of harmonizing these 2 sections in the disclosure law. So that's all I have, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I have.
Any questions? Thank you very much. Now we're going to discuss the citizens petition. And this is again, who's going to present an update on what's happening with your work groups? Bill?
Craig Williams is here as well.
Paul Higginbotham's coming up.
Okay,
Madam Chairwoman, how I appreciate you having us here today. Board members, good afternoon. I mentioned Craig Williams is here as well, representing the petitioners. Following up on our last board meeting, where we kind of gave a brief update, we are continuing to meet. We've met 2 times since the last board meeting. At that time, we were discussing how we are going down this new path that's evolved, and we're going down this new evolution of utilizing our state statute as it relates to wet weather subcategory rulemaking and the UAA use of sustainability analysis process. So we're still having those discussions along those lines, and the focus was a streamlined UAA process for the smaller communities in the state. So they wouldn't have to necessarily do the same level of technical modeling and the resources that some of the larger communities have that they do, but still achieve the requirements of the sustainability analysis. So that's the path we've been going down. We've been making some good progress on that. And but then we got thrown a curveball just recently a little bit. We were EPA has not yet approved the Fort Wayne wet weather subcategory rulemaking. So we've been wondering why that has been held up. So we've been in the process of just starting discussions with them to see what additional concerns or questions that they may have as it may relate to the Fort Wayne, because what comes from that, we want to make sure that our work group also addresses those issues before we go to them with a streamlined approach. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. And Craig, you want to speak on behalf of petitioners?
Well, I have a question while he's coming up. With the small communities that you're talking about, with the streamlined process, will the end result still have to be the same water quality that was under the original statute and rules?
Yes, the end result would be the same approach. We'd come to the board and actually have that rulemaking done through the board, which we think if there are all these standards change, that would be sent to EPA. But what we're trying to do is the mechanism to get to that rulemaking is the sustainability analysis. And it can be pretty involved if it needs to be, but we're trying to make sure that working with the petitioners on, again, I say small community, I'm not defining it, I'm just saying something less than the 10 largest communities in the state that we currently have that are doing this process. So yes, the end result would be the same. Coming to the board, the process would be the same, but we're trying to make it more efficient for these communities to be able to do the sustainability analysis approach.
Okay, well, I just really would be very reluctant to agree to lowering the water quality state that they would have to meet. The other thing that concerns me a little bit, how many of small communities have completed their CSO under the original regulations?
So the ones we have right now, there's 109 CSO communities in the state of Indiana. About 18 of those did complete sewer separation. That was their long-term control plan. So that left the remainders. We have 26 communities in the state of Indiana, including the top 10, which are also in the federal consent decrees, that have to do sustainability analysis and give them wet weather rulemaking as part of their consent decree requirements and or other enforceable state agreed judgments or agreed orders. And then we have roughly 60 plus communities that are doing the design storm approach, which is a high level of control, like the Angola situation, which Craig has dealt with, where it's the enforcement discretion issue for those communities, meaning if they meet their level of control, then we utilize our enforcement discretion. If they have a discharge above their level of control, which is a 10-year 1-hour storm event. So 26 right now for sure have to use sustainability analysis and rulemaking. The others can, if they so choose to do that approach. And that's the group that we're trying to figure out if they want to do that, they choose to do that, how can we make that process more efficient for the communities, for the agency, as well as for the board?
Well, I just, there's a little bit of fairness in here. Those that have completed it under the original rule and statute. And then now to change it so that some others can do it more cheaply. I mean, I hope we work it out, but it just seems to me to be a little bit unfair.
And I apologize, if I may have miscommunicated, they would not be allowed to do anything. The requirement is still having to meet the requirements of the use sustainability analysis as laid out in the Clean Water Act. They have to meet that. It's just, can they meet it in a way that's more cost effective to them? Because even in the situations about when it comes to costs, we look at costs for all communities when they do their long-term control plans, because we push them to burden, to a high level of burden before they can do something less. So all these communities are dealing with a significant cost to their communities and doing their long-term control plan project. So again, if I misspoke, I apologize. So they would still be held to the rigor of a use sustainability analysis process. Because if we did not do that, then EPA would not approve the rulemaking, even if the board approved it. So they're not getting off. We're just trying to make it more efficient. So I apologize for that miscommunication.
Well, no, you didn't misspeak. I just wanted to make sure that I understood it, and I appreciate your explanation. Any other questions for him?
And I don't know if I think Craig would like to speak on behalf of the petitioners.
Okay,
Just real quick, I'll follow up with, Paul, we do continue to work with the agency and appreciate that opportunity. On behalf of the petitioners, we do have some concern about some of the issues that it sounds like EPA Region 5 may be having with Fort Wayne's UAA application. This is one of the concerns that we have in moving multiple communities through this process. We are still working with Paul and his work group on the focused UAA process to see, try to bring something to completion, and certainly appreciate their accommodation with that. But do recognize that I think this addresses some of our concerns, sort of validates some of our concerns we have with this process.
And just to that point, I'll do counterpoint. I can understand we do have the concerns with the process and things that are happening right now. We're hoping to work those out. But I can say that if there's concerns on behalf of EPA as it relates to Fort Wayne, who's getting down to like 4 overflows in a typical year, and they're having issues with that, there's absolutely no way EPA will allow for the implementation of the 2012 criteria to address this issue, because that could allow up to 36 overflows in a year. So while we work through this process, this is still, in my opinion, from a regulator, it's still going to happen a lot sooner than EPA allowing a 2012 criteria approach that would allow more overflows in a typical year. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
when do you think you all will be to the point that we'll see a rule and put this thing to bed?
Well, that's a good question. Sure, we're hoping, we're hoping a year ago, right? So it's something that we're going to continue, because regardless of what the board does with this petition, regardless of that, we still have to continue to meet with the petitioners and the folks on the petition group as well, just to continue to work through this process and figure it out, because of some of these issues that have come up with Fort Wayne. I think we'll know more after we've had some discussions with EPA and Fort Wayne together, trying to work through that and find out what exactly the concerns may be related to, is there additional information that's needed? Is there some timing issue that's a problem? So we're hoping in the next couple of months at least to have finalized some discussions between Fort Wayne and EPA, so we know the path forward and what the next steps are. But in the meantime, as long as the petitioners are willing to meet and discuss, be it the UAA process, be it the petition that they've submitted or something in between, we're willing to do that as an agency to try to work through this, because it is a complicated issue and it can be costly, as Craig has pointed out. So we do want to make sure we have the most efficient process put into place that we can.
Well, for instance, if we had a motion, say our next meeting, to deny the petition, you all would still continue to meet and work to resolve this issue, correct?
Yes, because we have to, because of these things that come up. It's something we're, before in the past, we're now getting to the point in these implementation, these long-term control plans, to where we're getting close to the end of some of them, and some are done, like Angola, Craig's situation, Angola, they're done. But now we're getting closer to some of these other ones being completed. So we have to get to the point of, okay, now permits are gonna start changing in attachment A's, and we have to make sure that we know how to draft that up as it relates to the wet weather subcategory rulemaking, or be it some other mechanism. So yes, we're going to continue to work with these folks as much as we can to get something resolved.
Okay, are there other questions for either the petitioners or the staff?
Guess what? I have a question. 36 overflows using the other standard. Could you explain that?
Okay, and I'm not speaking on, yeah, we're going to do the point counterpoint. I can't speak for them, but this is my interpretation of their initial presentation of the 2012 criteria allows a 10% allowance for, non-compliance, basically, or outside the limits. For 10% of samples. My interpretation is petitioners are wanting to apply time to, instead of samples, they'd actually apply time to 10% of the time. So say, for instance, so 365 days a year, 10% of 365 makes 36. So in theory, you have 36 days with the CSO, untreated CSO discharge, and be in compliance with that interpretation.
Yeah, that's not the way I read the rule.
Right, no, but that's for it to work for CSO program, that's how you would have.
I thought
There's no
the
other way
issue
to
was
read
that you were lowering the E. coli and then the averaging period of that. That was a difference in the standard.
And so from the petitioners, our interpretation, our desire would be, first of all, high level of control is the post-construction monitoring of the CSO plan. So community completes their long-term control plan, tells IDEM, hey, we're done. IDEM establishes they complete a review of that community's long-term control plan, and that criteria that we're talking about wouldn't be in place until IDEM verifies that community's long-term control plan has been achieved. And so it provides a compliance pathway post long-term control plan, not beforehand. And so there's no way that Paul's crew would approve a long-term control plan and post-construction monitoring evaluation if they were still having 10, 20 CSOs. So in the technical realm, Paul's right, but you have to achieve that milestone first of completing your long-term control plan post-construction monitoring. And so there's the struggle, I think, is trying to figure out how to make that work in the rule. And that's I think the area where we've had problems.
I think that would deviate from the adoption of the 2018 rec criteria. If we're just going to adopt the 2018 rec criteria, that doesn't have a CSO overlay in it. So we would have to modify that rule to implement what Craig just explained.
Yeah, it's really,
It's a mess.
it's tough.
Cookie.
Commissioner,
Yes.
please give some thought, you and your staff, to the board. If you would approve of me submitting a motion to deny the petition but also a resolution requesting that this work group continue working to resolve the issues. I hate to have that petition hanging out there. I don't want to lower the water quality standard, which is what that petition, if we followed it, would do. Give some thought to going ahead and denying the petition, but a resolution, having them go ahead and work this out.
Okay.
If anybody thinks that's a terrible idea, let me know.
Not a terrible idea, but I do have a question about our current standard. I don't know the history of where we came up with our E. coli numbers that, put IM ahead of the game, not just, bacteria. So, how our number, it's definitely differences on level and averaging. So where do we come up with our number?
I'm gonna ask Jerry Dittmer, our branch chief, to come up and maybe give you some background on that. Jerry, this is Jerry Dittmer, he's our branch chief of our permits group, which the CSO program falls under Jerry's branch.
Thank you, board members. Your question about our existing E. coli criteria, they were based on a 1986 study that EPA did that correlated swimmers' exposure at beaches to different incident levels of sickness or illness, intestinal distress caused by waterborne pathogens. They looked at different organisms and which correlated better in actual human illness to the amounts of bacteria that were sampled. Through that study, that's how they came up with a 1986 recommendation of 125 E. coli monthly average is geometric mean, and then in a swimming beach setting, a daily maximum single sample value of 235 count. So that's what ours was originally based on. Indiana moved fairly quickly to adopt that. And we took those recommendations literally as far as the daily maximum, which early on led to some implementation problems when we applied that directly to wastewater discharges. And so we made some amendments later on to the E. coli criteria related to allowing 10% of samples to exceed the daily maximum from wastewater plants. It's because E. coli varies with sampling. So the original basis is a 1986 EPA epidemiological study on swimming exposure.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions from anyone? Do either of you all, the petitioner or the staff, have any more comments?
No, we do not.
We do not, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there anybody else out there in the audience that needs to address this? Okay, this is the open forum. Is there anybody out there that wishes to address the board today? You can be out there or you can be on the internet, either one. Okay, if not, the next meeting of the Environmental Rules Board is tentatively set for November the 9th, 2022 at 1:30, Conference Room A, Indiana Government Center South. It's a tentative date and subject to change, so we'll keep you updated as if there is a change. Thank you all. It's been kind of a long meeting. We had a lot to do, but we got a lot done. Is there a motion to adjourn? Well, first of all, I guess, should I ask you, commissioners, since you weren't here at the beginning, do you have anything to say?
I think Par covered most of it. I apologize for being tardy. I was at the Wetlands Task Force meeting and we were final adopting our report. It should be coming out in the next month or so. So I look forward to seeing that finished product, and I'm really proud of the group of stakeholders that got together to study the issue and then put out that report. So that's about it. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else on the board have a comment or anything? Okay, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved. This is Ted Nemec.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, nay. We are adjourned. Thank you all very much. We've gotten a lot done today.
We have. Well, we.